My parents laughed. That's the only sound I remember that night. The sharp, mocking laughter echoing across the dinner table as I told them I wanted to join the military. My father leaned back, smirking, and my mother shook her head like I was a child asking for a pony. You? In uniform? Don't be ridiculous, she said. They didn't know that one day their laughter would die in their throats when the president of the country himself would stand the moment I walked into the room. I didn't answer them that night. I just sat there staring at the plate of cold potatoes, listening to their laughter dig into me like tiny knives. My sister smirked too. The perfect daughter who already had her life mapped out. Business school, marriage into money, a life of comfort. She was the one they invested in, the one they praised at every family gathering. Me? I was the dreamer, the one who wasted time running laps at dawn, reading military history books, and sketching out battle plans on the backs of notebooks. My parents called it a phase, something I'd grow out of once I realized the world didn't work that way. What they didn't understand was that my dream wasn't a phase. It was survival. When you grow up in a house where you are constantly reminded that you are less, that you'll never measure up, you start to crave a place where effort actually matters, where sweat and discipline count for more than whose child you are. That was the military for me. The next morning, I set my alarm for 4:30 and ran until my lungs felt like fire. I pushed myself harder each day, not because I wanted to prove anything to them, but because deep down I knew I was building something no one could take away from me. Still, the comments never stopped. At my high school graduation, my father whispered just loud enough for my aunt to hear, "She's wasting her time. She'll quit after the first week of training." I kept my eyes on the stage, pretending. His words bounced off, but I felt them burn into me. Even when I filled out the application for officer school, my mother rolled her eyes and asked if I was doing it for attention. Every step I took toward my dream was a battle, not against the tests or the training, but against the voices of my own family telling me I wasn't enough. When the acceptance letter came, I didn't show it to them right away. I sat alone in my room, holding the envelope with trembling hands, reading the words over and over until they blurred. You have been admitted. My chest swelled with something I hadn't felt in years. Vindication. I waited until dinner that night, slid the A letter across the table, and watched their faces shift. My mother's smile froze, my father's fork clattered against his plate, and my sister muttered, "You're actually serious about this." That was the first moment in my life I saw silence from them, the first crack in their certainty that I would fail. But silence is not support. They didn't congratulate me. They didn't hug me. Instead, my father said, "Well, don't come crying back when you realize you can't handle it." My mother added, "We won't be bailing you out when it gets too hard." I nodded, calm. On the outside, though, inside I was on fire. I wasn't asking them to bail me out. I was preparing to leave them behind. Training was worse than anything I had imagined, but it was also everything I had prayed for. The first week broke people, literally. We lost recruits to injuries, breakdowns, panic attacks, and I watched tough-looking men crumble under the weight of exhaustion. My body ached in ways I didn't think were possible. My arms shook after endless push-ups. My legs burned after carrying packs heavier than some of the recruits themselves. But every time I wanted to give in, I heard my father's voice in my head. "You can't handle it." And that voice didn't break me. It fueled me. I told myself I'd rather collapse face first in the mud than prove him right. Nights were the hardest. Lying on thin mattresses in the barracks, listening to snores and muffled cries, I sometimes felt like a child again. Alone, desperate for a shred of belief from someone who claimed to love me. But each sunrise reset me. Each sunrise meant another chance to prove I wasn't weak, another step toward the life I wanted. I didn't just train my body. I trained my mind to silence the noise of doubt, to hear only the orders, the rhythm of my boots against the ground, the beat of my own heart telling me to keep going. When I graduated basic training, my parents didn't come. They sent a short text. Congrats. That was all. Other recruits hugged their families, took pictures, cried with pride. I stood alone, smiling through tears I refused to let fall. I told myself it didn't matter, but of course it did. I wanted them to see what I had become, to realize their daughter was not a failure but a soldier. Still, I kept walking forward, because I had learned something in those months. Recognition doesn't build you, discipline does. Years passed, and with each one I climbed higher. I specialized, I earned medals, I took on roles that tested every fiber of who I was. I met commanders who saw potential in me, who pushed me harder because they believed I could take it. Slowly, I started making a name for myself, not as someone's daughter, not as the dreamer, but as an officer who delivered results. And every time my name was called for an award, every time a superior shook my hand, I felt another piece of my parents' laughter lose its grip on me. What I didn't know then was how far it would all lead, and how one day the very people who dismissed me would have to sit down in front of a screen and watch the moment the president of the country himself rose to his feet. Not for them, not for my sister, but for me. Deployments hardened me in ways I never could have predicted. The first time I stepped into a war zone, I realized just how small and fragile I was in the face of chaos. The air carried dust and fear, the nights were long and restless, punctuated by distant explosions and radio chatter. But instead of breaking me, it clarified everything. I learned to read people in seconds, to trust my instincts, to make decisions that sometimes meant life or death. I learned what true leadership looked like, not the empty authority my parents had wielded in our home, but the kind that earns respect through sacrifice and courage. I remember one mission where our convoy was ambushed. I had to pull one of my men out of a burning vehicle while bullets cracked overhead. My hands blistered, my uniform singed, but when we got him to safety, and he looked at me with eyes full of trust, I understood why I had fought so hard to be here. No laughter from a dining room table could erase the truth of that moment. The military became my family in the way I had always craved. We celebrated each other's victories, mourned each other's losses, and held one another up when the weight was unbearable. Letters from my parents grew fewer, shorter, more dismissive, until eventually they stopped altogether. It was as if they had erased me from their version of family because I didn't fit their narrative. My sister got married, had her glamorous wedding, and from the pictures online I could see the pride glowing on my parents' faces. I wasn't invited. I wasn't even mentioned. It stung, but it also set me free. If they couldn't see my worth, I no longer needed their vision at all. With every rank I earned, with every assignment completed, my name circulated further up the chain. I was invited to brief senior officials, to present strategies, to advise in situations where failure wasn't an option. Each time I entered those rooms, I carried the echo of my parents' laughter like a ghost in the corner, reminding me of where I started. But instead of haunting me, it sharpened me. It reminded me that the only approval I needed was my own and the trust of the soldiers beside me. Then came the day I was told I would be honored at a national ceremony for distinguished service. The kind of ceremony that wasn't just about medals, but about the recognition of sacrifice at the highest level. When the invitation arrived, stamped with the seal of the president, I stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of all the years that had led me here. I knew my parents would hear about it. I knew they would see. And though I told myself I didn't care, deep down I wanted them to finally understand that the daughter they had mocked, dismissed, and abandoned was about to walk into a room that would forever rewrite her story. The day of the ceremony felt surreal from the moment I woke up. I polished my uniform until it gleamed, the medals aligned perfectly, every crease sharp enough to cut. As I stood in front of the mirror, I saw not just a soldier, but every version of myself layered together. The girl who once sat at that dinner table humiliated, the recruit who ran on burning lungs, the officer who pulled a man out of fire, the woman who had built herself from rejection into steel. When I arrived at the Grand Hall, the air itself felt charged. Rows of officials, military leaders, and foreign dignitaries filled the seats. Cameras lined the walls, lights glaring. It was overwhelming, but I walked forward with steady steps, the sound of my boots echoing against the marble floor. I reminded myself that this wasn't about them. It was about everything I had endured to stand here. The announcer's voice rang out, introducing me with a list of accomplishments that felt both heavy and distant. Words like distinguished, courage, service beyond the call of duty. My chest swelled, not with pride alone, but with a sense of vindication that went beyond medals. And then it happened. The president himself rose to his feet as I entered. One by one, the entire hall followed, applause thundering through the chamber. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had imagined this 1,000 times, but reality was sharper, louder, more powerful than any dream. My parents' laughter from years ago collided with the sound of hundreds of people honoring me, and in that instant, the power shifted forever. I was no longer the girl who had been dismissed. I was the woman who had commanded respect at the highest level. Later, as I stood on the stage with the medal placed around my neck, flashes from cameras blinding me, I thought of them. Were they watching from home? Were they silent now, finally confronted with the truth they had denied for so long? I didn't need their validation anymore, but I knew this moment was forcing them to see what they had refused to. And that was enough. After the ceremony, as officials came forward to shake my hand, as strangers saluted me, I realized that I had carved a place in the world that no one, not even my own parents, could erase. Walking out of that hall, I carried not just the weight of the medal, but the quiet knowledge that I had rewritten the story of my life. They had laughed, but I had risen. They had doubted, but I had endured. And now, even the president of the nation had stood in my honor. That was the day their laughter died, and my silence finally roared louder than anything they could say. After the ceremony, the world seemed to open in ways I had never thought possible. Reporters wanted my story, magazines asked for interviews, and universities invited me to speak to their cadets. I accepted some, declined others, but each invitation reminded me of the contrast between who I had been told I was and who I had become. I started receiving letters from young women across the country, some barely 18, saying they wanted to follow the same path but were afraid their families wouldn't believe in them. Each time I read those words, I felt a sharp pang in my chest because I knew exactly what that felt like. So I answered every letter. I told them the truth, that belief doesn't always come from the people you expect it to, and that sometimes you have to build your own belief 1 push-up, 1 mile, 1 sleepless night at a time. Meanwhile, my parents stayed silent. For months, they said nothing, as if ignoring the reality would erase it. But silence carries its own message. I heard from distant relatives that they'd been bragging quietly, telling people their daughter was in the military, but leaving out the years of doubt, the cruel jokes, the dismissals. They wanted credit without admitting guilt. It stung, but it also made me realize something vital. Their version of my story no longer mattered. The world had seen who I was. The president himself had stood for me. My parents' approval, or lack of it, had shrunk into something powerless. One evening, as I prepared for another assignment overseas, I got a message from my sister. She wrote, "Mom and Dad want to see you. They're proud of you now." I sat staring at the words, my hands still on the packed duffel bag beside me. For years, I had wanted to hear those words. For years, I had craved that sentence. But reading it now, after everything, it felt hollow. Pride that comes only when the cameras turn your way isn't pride. It's performance. And I wasn't willing to let myself be their performance anymore. I replied simply, "Tell them I'm busy serving my country." Then I put my phone down and zipped up my bag. My life wasn't waiting in their living room. It was waiting out there, where I made a difference, where respect was earned through action, not handed out like a belated apology. For the first time in my life, I felt free of their grip. Free of their laughter, their silence, and even their belated pride. Years later, when my name began appearing in military journals and I was asked to consult on national security issues, my parents finally reached out directly. A letter arrived in a stiff white envelope, written in my father's handwriting, which I hadn't seen since high school. He wrote that they had always known I was strong, that they had just worried the military would break me, that their laughter back then had been nerves, not doubt. I read the words slowly, letting the irony wash over me. For so many years I had begged, even silently, for that kind of acknowledgement. Now that it came, wrapped in revision and half-truths, it felt like nothing at all. I folded the letter neatly and slid it into a drawer, not out of anger, but out of understanding. The validation I once sought could never heal me, because I had already healed myself. My sister called not long after. Her voice was sharper now, tinged with envy she didn't bother to hide. She asked why I hadn't visited, why I was pretending to be too important for family dinners. I reminded her of the wedding I hadn't been invited to, of the birthdays I had spent alone while they celebrated her milestones, of the years my existence had been erased. She went quiet and then said, "Well, things are different now. People look up to you. Don't you think it's time to forgive?" Forgiveness. As if forgiveness was a favor owed, a duty I had neglected. I told her calmly that forgiveness doesn't erase history. It only frees the one who grants it. And in that sense, I had already forgiven them long ago. But it didn't mean I owed them my presence. That was the line I drew, and I wasn't stepping back over it. Instead, I focused on building a new kind of family. The soldiers I mentored, the young recruits who reminded me of myself, became the brothers and sisters I had always needed. We laughed together in dusty barracks, we carried each other through impossible missions, and when one of us stumbled, the others lifted them up. That was family. That was pride. In those bonds, I finally understood that blood alone doesn't define love, actions do. And my parents had shown their actions long ago. The memory of the president standing for me never faded. It became the quiet symbol of everything I had achieved, a single moment that carried the weight of years. Whenever doubt crept back in, whenever exhaustion threatened to swallow me, I returned to that image, the applause, the rising bodies, the undeniable recognition that my life had mattered beyond the walls of my childhood home. On the 10th anniversary of my service, I was invited back to that same grand hall for another ceremony. This time, I wasn't just receiving an award. I was speaking to the next generation of officers. Standing at the podium, looking out at rows of young faces filled with both fear and determination, I thought of the girl I used to be, sitting at a dinner table while her parents laughed at her dreams. I told the cadets the truth, that the path ahead would be brutal, that they would be tested in ways they couldn't yet imagine, that the world wouldn't always clap for them, but that their strength would be forged in those exact moments of doubt. I saw heads nodding, eyes brightening, and I knew I wasn't just telling my story. I was handing them a piece of armor they could carry into their own battles. After the speech, a line of cadets formed to shake my hand. One young woman lingered, her hands trembling as she finally stepped forward. She whispered that her parents thought she was throwing her life away by joining the military, that they laughed at her too, and that she had almost quit before hearing me speak. I held her gaze and said, "Don't let their laughter define your future. Let your actions do that." She broke into tears and hugged me, and in that embrace I felt a full circle moment. My pain had become someone else's strength. That was worth more than any medal. News of the event spread quickly, and once again my parents couldn't ignore it. This time, they called. My mother's voice cracked with rehearsed emotion as she said they wanted to make things right, that they wanted me to come home for a visit so they could show me how proud they were. I listened silently, letting the words hang in the air. A decade too late, I thought. Pride that blooms only under the spotlight isn't love, it's convenience. I told her gently but firmly, I don't need that anymore. I already have a family who never doubted me. Her silence was heavy, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. For once, it wasn't my silence carrying the weight, it was theirs. That night, I walked through the quiet city streets, the metal from the day heavy around my neck, and realized something profound. Revenge hadn't been about proving them wrong in their faces. It had been about building a life so undeniable that their laughter turned irrelevant. Every accolade, every salute, every moment the world recognized me was proof that I had risen above them. And the greatest revenge was not anger or confrontation. It was the peace I carried now, a peace they could never take away. When I think back to that night at the dinner table, their laughter feels like it belonged to another lifetime. The girl who sat there shrinking under their smirks is gone, replaced by a woman who carved her own path through fire and doubt. My parents still live in the same house, still hold the same small circles where image means more than truth, where appearances are currency. And I walk into rooms where leaders of nations stand to greet me. I lead missions that shape the future of lives far beyond my own. The gulf between their world and mine has grown so vast that their opinions no longer carry weight, only echoes. There came a day, not long ago, when I returned to my hometown for a private event at a veterans memorial. The town square was crowded, people gathered with flags and flowers, honoring those who had given everything. As I stepped onto the stage, I saw familiar faces in the crowd. Neighbors who once whispered that I was chasing a foolish fantasy, teachers who had advised me to pick something more practical, and in the very back, my parents, standing stiff and silent. They didn't approach me afterward. They didn't try to speak. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe the distance between who I had become and who they once believed me to be was too wide to bridge. And I didn't need it bridged. I placed my hand on the names etched in stone and whispered a silent promise to keep living in a way that honored sacrifice, discipline, and courage. Not doubt, not laughter. In quiet moments, I realized that the real victory wasn't in medals or ceremonies, though those were powerful. The real victory was the freedom I won when I stopped chasing their approval. I no longer look back hoping for words they were never capable of giving. Instead, I look forward, to the soldiers I mentor, to the young women who see in me a reflection of what they can become, to the nation I continue to serve with every ounce of strength I have left. Their laughter was loud once, but now it is only a faint memory, drowned out by applause, by salutes, by respect that was earned and cannot be taken away. Revenge, in the end, wasn't about humiliating them or forcing apologies. It was about proving to myself that I was everything they said I could never be. It was about walking into that grand hall and watching the president of the country rise to his feet, not for the image of me my parents had mocked, but for the woman I had forged in spite of them. That moment lives with me forever, not as a weapon against them, but as a shield for myself. So if you ask me what became of that girl whose dreams were laughed at, I'll tell you she grew into a soldier, a leader, and a woman who no longer bends under the weight of anyone's doubt. My parents laughed once, but the world stood. And in that silence between laughter and applause, I found my freedom.